There's still people coming in, Claire?
They are, but I'm admitting them. But I think we can get going because it's 12:01, so we're on schedule to start.
Balance is insufficient.
Let me just mute some people.
Okay, so I think we'll get started. This is one of the seminars. I think we've had a couple already in a series under our project called TSITICA, and you'll see that on Belinda's slide. And TSITICA stands for Transforming Social Inequalities Through Inclusive Climate Action. And it's a collaborative, multi-country, interdisciplinary project. It brings together researchers from the universities of Nairobi, Ghana, Cape Town, Bristol, East Anglia, Manchester, and the School of Economics and Political Science, the London School of Economics and Political Science. So the TSITICA project aims to address the nexus of climate change, sustainable development, poverty and inequality, to understand how climate change actions, and here we're talking mitigation and adaptation, can be socially and synergistic with several of, but primarily one, poverty, gender and inequality. So include several other SDGs depending on what projects we look at. So a big project, and hopefully you'll be hearing more from us, and we'll be hosting 3 years. So I think many of you here know Professor Belinda Reyers. She's a research chair in science at Future Africa at the University of Pretoria. She also holds a joint position as senior advisor at the Stockholm University. And I don't think production, we do know her that she's, from the fact she's led a lot of large international, such as the GEF, DFID, EU, UNEP, and has played a number of advisory and leadership roles in both national and international, including Earth, the IPBES, the expert groups on the Sustainable Development Goals, advisory group of the Wellcome Trust, and a whole lot of other international roles here today. And I know she's always had an interest in socio-ecological systems and development, and more recently, specifically been doing a lot of thinking around and sustainability. So without anything more, and we'll have some questions.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Claire, for making this happen. And thanks to all of you for making the time in what is a very chaotic, busy and exhausting year and month. I hope everyone is doing okay. As Shiona said, this is an opportunity to discuss a few ideas and some examples of work that I've been involved with in integrated approach to equity and sustainability. A few slides together to showcase some of that work, but we left quite a lot of time at the end because it'd be really nice to have this as a more integrative and interactive discussion. Experiences. And at the end, I'm also going to provide a bit of information to get hold of me and link to some of the projects I'm mentioning, so that this is, if you're interested in taking it further. Okay, so without further ado, let me start my timer so I don't put us all to sleep. I also am in a very strange, in my neighborhood has decided that today would be a good, so there's a bit of drilling and banging. Just let me know if it disturbs, otherwise I'm just going to carry on. Right, so a lot of this work has its roots ago in the sort of 2015 period science policy interface was very busy. There were lots of environmental assessment reports coming out on climate change and biodiversity loss. We were seeing lots of the Millennium Development Goals being released at the same time as there were these big negotiations with the Paris Agreement to address climate change, UN General Assembly negotiations around the 30 Agenda and setting the Sustainable Development Goals. And so it was a very busy time, and at the same time we were trying to mobilize the science or research network, which was an effort to try and build a network that was more global, more generative, and more interdisciplinary in spanning all the disciplines that we needed to address all these emerging existing challenges in the space of and sustainable development. And so a lot of these reports and policy moments were very focused on the worrying trends we were seeing. And I'm not going to show you all those, but you'll hear on Earth system and environmental trends. So we were seeing, you know, what is in terms of things like global temperature, and then also species extinction rates really picking up in recent decades across a variety of groups of animals. And just large-scale changes in the Earth system, massive deforestation, large reef die-offs in the ocean, to our atmosphere through increasing pollution, not only of greenhouse gases. And so these were the sort of pictures we were getting out of the environmental sector. And at the same time, we were starting to see some more positive trends potentially being reported out of the broader development sector, as we were seeing real progress being made in measures like extreme poverty. But when one starts to dig into these, they're not as positive, right? You know, we're still seeing significant amounts of extremely poor people. If one has a look at sub-Saharan Africa, not really able to get below 40% of the population living in extreme poverty. And even where we were seeing some gains, we were also starting to see some reversals in poverty relief efforts. And when one started to look at measures like food insecurity, for example, the last 5 years show a general increase in levels of food insecurity around the world, which kind of counteracts the massive improvements one had been seeing in food insecurity up to 2014, 2015. And we all know that COVID-19 and climate change are further exacerbating these worrying trends. And then the World Social Sciences Report in 2016 published their large synthesis called Challenging Inequalities, Pathways to a Just World, where for one of the first times we were able to pull together a global picture of what we were seeing in terms of both rising inequalities, in other words, the world becoming a place where the gap between rich and poor was much greater, but not only in small parts of the world, actually all over the world, it was globalizing. And so in the top graphic there, remembering with the Gini coefficient on the left, you want to be around 0.2 to live in an equal society, and you want to be quite far away from 0.5. And we see with all our emerging economies, although data is sparse, we're not doing a great job at building equal societies. And particularly bleak when you start to include the so-called industrialized developed countries, where you see most of them moving away from equal societies to increasingly unequal societies, even including countries like Sweden, which have been held up as the poster child of an equal society. And I think this sort of spurred us all on to recognize that really, you know, when it comes to what we were trying to do to make the world a better place, it came down to these two key defining challenges. We had to do something to reduce these trends of increasing and globalizing inequalities, and we had to accelerate efforts to achieve sustainability to address these Earth system trends. But before I get into talking about these challenges and their potential relationships or lack thereof, I thought it might be useful to also reflect on the context in which we're trying to address these challenges and how that may have changed in the recent past. And I think, you know, although humans have had an impact on Earth systems and Earth systems have had an impact on humans for a very long time, we are starting to see a very different looking global context when one looks at a couple of dimensions. The first is, we all know we live in a very connected, a hyper-connected world. And that graphic on the left summarizes it pretty well, where we have a very connected flow of information, people, and material resources moving around the world in seamless and impossibly fast and connected ways. We have a global market that's incredibly connected, and global trade and financialization supporting that. And of course, we have global environmental change, which affects all parts of the world and not just a few parts. And the thing about this hyperconnection is that these sorts of changes and flows can create vulnerabilities in often far distant places from perhaps where those flows began. So we're seeing a sort of hyperconnected, vulnerable world. At the same time, we're starting to see not only that the world is changing, but that that rate of change has picked up. And these graphics in the middle, which I drew just a set from Will Stephen's recent report in 2015, where you see those graphs starting to go from linear to exponential is in about 1950, where we see across a variety of social, economic, and environmental trends, we see a massive increase in the rate of change. And of course, for those of you studying the Earth system, we also know that that rate of change is to what are called these tipping points, which are these kind of thresholds, and on those, we see accelerations in the responses to the change. So we see ourselves in this global context that's connected, that's changing quite quickly, and that is changing in highly unpredictable and not the Anthropocene. And described it as a global context that is full of intertwined drivers, complex features, emergent phenomena, and unintended consequences. And it's trying, we're moving outside of the historic of our Earth system variables. So our climate is different, our terms of the species composition that makes up our planet. Pollution levels look different. We have novel chemicals in our environment now. And, you know, there's still obviously a lot of debate going on. The geologists are debating whether it's a recognizable epoch. There's a lot of debate about the name and the actual concept. And there's a lot of debate about who caused the Anthropocene and whether it is really humanity written by humans. And I'm going to get into that a bit later. But needless to say, it's become a very popular way of describing this hyperconnected, rapidly changing and unpredictable context. As you can see in the bottom, rates, both in terms of scientific publications, but also popular publications, and then new journals actually with the word anthropocene. Whatever you want to call it, I think most people agree that we're living in a changing global context. And in the recently released global report of on biodiversity, we start to drill down to some of the causal factors behind. And that is in the last 50 or 70 population. And I mean, this is a frequently cited but upsetting statistic behind this changing context. And then we've doubled the amount of people on Earth, we've quadrupled our economy, and we have increased global trade times. And this has resulted in an increasing spatial segregation of where resources are produced and where they're consumed. And we see it all today in the food we eat, in the clothes we buy, the computers we produce. We are increasingly resources and dumping waste in to support lifestyles. This all is this really frightening graphic together in the World Social Sciences report, but we see Oxfam and Forbes and others reporting it, that if the blue line presents the 50% of population total wealth over time, and there are people, so about 3 to 4 billion people, the red line is 62 people. And we just see how over time this concentration of economic wealth, and of course that goes hand in hand with political power, has just increased over time. A situation where 62 people have more control than 4 billion people over our markets, our economy, and our planet in general. Something that one can then see playing out in, although we use the Anthropocene to describe this global context, we actually are aware that in contexts with a lot of asymmetries or biases in the way different parts of the world work. And these are some graphs that I pulled from the IPBES graph B. Okay, so purple line is developed countries and red line is least developed countries. And one just gets an idea of the bias in who's consuming, who's producing, and who's wasting. And so here you see that, you know, people in the developed world consuming 4 times as much least developed countries. But then at the same time, when we look just below that at air pollution, we see that people in the least developed countries are exposed to double the amount of average mean annual exposure to air pollution than those in the developed world. A lot of this material consumption that produces a lot of pollution is not happening in the developed countries. It's happening in least developed, and it's also coming at a cost of health in least developed countries who are not necessarily benefiting from the increased materials made. And so I think this kind of brings us full circle to these 2 defining challenges of our time about reducing inequalities and accelerating sustainability. And I think when one starts to consider this very intertext that we live in, this very hyper-connected time with a lot of, one starts to get a sense of the relationships between these 2. They remain very siloed and very science and in policy and practice. Into communities studying them, policy communities addressing them, different funding streams. And so although we have on one hand, je may live in this time of interconnection and complexity and consequences, we as an intervening narrow. And although all of us know that there's a literature that has the links between inequality and environmental degradation, for example, it's not really at the scale or count the 2 as anything more than cause or effect of each other. Very challenged to address. Back on this notion that was very dominant at the time, that you could either address equity or safety, and they kind of were trading off with each other. And so you couldn't have both, was the idea. This is the kind of graphic I'm not even going to reference where I found it. It's so disagreeable to me, but it comes with this very thinking that protect life on land or biodiversity to achieve hunger targets. So really equate production of food on land, and we and physical in its causes. So land competition is not the problem behind hunger. We saw that here in South Africa, where we had a bumper year for agriculture and also a year of increasing food security. And this trade-off between sustainability or protecting biodiversity and reduced inequalities, where we're assuming protected areas and remove people from that land, therefore inequalities. And, you know, that's not the way we really think about looking after biodiversity, as that has to happen by removing people off the land. So we really wanted to challenge coming out of the goals of sort of pitting these 2 concepts against each other. And so this was the paper that in 2018 across many of us working in the Future Earth community. We thought we should be looking at challenges of equity and sustainability and how we achieve them both, and how connected and intertwined. And in this paper, we raised the point that no longer possible or desirable, considering this interconnected context we live in, to address them separately. And we actually called for new thinking and new approaches that not only recognize how they link to each other, but also the multiple perspectives and dimensions involved. And it was this that we found was a key stumbling block. The way we think about equity and sustainability, very narrowed, very focused on single dimensions and very static. And so, for example, this is how we were trying to present equity as this very broad set of multiple dimensions: social, cultural, environmental, spatial, political dimensions of building equal societies and equal communities. And also not equity between man and woman, between rich and ethnicity, geography, identity, and also intersect. And of course, not just equity as in who benefits from what in sort of a distribution way, but equity also in who participates in those decisions and interventions. And then, of course, the fundamental components of equity that are underpinned by recognition rights and tenure, which we know have been shaped in very racist and sexist ways for centuries, really, around the world, and really will frustrate any efforts at distributional procedural equity of this term sustainability, which everyone I speak to interprets it in very different ways. I think a lot of this is influenced by the 1980s, 1990s thinking around sustainability, where it was very much an environmental concept about the limits to growth, the green handbrake on development, almost an anti-development. And here we and only in resources within the environment threaten our own development. Focused on intergenerations, so future generations, current patterns of inequality. And sort of by the 2000s, we were starting to get the sense that sustainability was had an environmental dimension, a social dimension, and an economic dimension, or the three pillars. But there was some suggestion within that notion that you could were also sort of important components of sustainability. As we see sustainability in a much more holistic way, in recognizing that there is no that isn't embedded in a sustainable society, and there is no sustainable society. And so this brings to the fore that we're actually talking about sustainability of a diverse range of values, of benefits, and of human nature relationships. And we can start talking about sustainability as kind of a safe and that we're increasingly for future generations, but currently, and the different impacts on well-being across different. And that we stop seeing sustainability as like an endpoint and a linear trajectory, or as but rather understanding it as an emergent dynamic co-development process. Or that sustainability isn't an objective and value neutral word, it's incredible. And this needed some recognition, we thought, in equity and sustainability. And it's why it doesn't just replace equity. And I think, so we've started to see increasingly, for example, this paper by Professor Leyla, the point that actually we don't really have what is sustainable, what is equitable, what is environmental, what is social, and what is justice. In his recent paper examining how well-being in the global south as goals about individual well-being, equity in terms of intra-generational, so between groups of people now, and also about sustainability generations and their relationship to now. And his point is that, you know, in the many sort of capitalism is always interpreted as this, and but in fact, he said from a global south perspective, these dimensions of a good society, it spiritual well-being, the individual and distributive components of well-being, as well as the present and the future. So strengthening the voices coming from this sustainability are part of society and not actually trade-offs against one another. And we've seen this kind of this type of approach more recently, new ways of thinking from a high-level dialogue hosted by the UNDP and the International Council on how we can re-articulate human connections between the environment and the soon-to-be-released out now in December, actually talks about in balance with the planet, which is a very different level. And then, of course, we have the Sustainable Development Goals, which is all about this interconnection and prosperity. In trying to find new thinking and new approaches, you know, as soon as you start blurring boundaries and saying, well, sustainability, and you can't draw a line between environment and society, analytically, that can be quite problematic to do research on and how we engage in systems and reach points in systems. And so in this work that we were doing as part of Future Earth, we were interested to try more analytically rigorous ways to in these complex challenges. And so one area that's very popular for sort of blurring boundaries is systems approaches, because how entities are connected to one another, whether economic or biological. And there are many examples, thinking from military campaigns all the way through security. But the particular subset of systems we're keen to explore was the subset of social-ecological systems, which is an area that I've been working in for a long time. And social-ecological systems are at their heart complex and adaptive systems. Entities, forming networks, creating emergent behavior, but fundamentally this perspective of nature. So it talks about systems as embedded and interdependent societies and ecosystems. So it's a particular type of approach which seemed useful for exploring these links between equity and ability. And so over the past few years, we've been digging into this massive literature on social ecological to find sort of entry points, analytical approaches, and also new theories, perhaps new conceptual framework. We can engage with these complex challenges in more sort of joined up and intertwined ways. And we've come up with a list of principles or insights through all of those, but I could spend the next maybe 5 to 10 minutes just exploring two of these major categories of kind of lenses and approaches that we've been exploring. And then I can reference the other literature if anyone's interested in exploring that. So these two areas really sort of changing the very linear and simplistic way we think about the connections between human and ecosystems. So on the for how we think about these, so we see ecosystems as kind of providing this flow of services to the human system, who then consumes services, and then the human system puts waste back in the system and perhaps alters and logs and the ecosystem, and so changes that ecosystem. But it's a very sort of simplistic material and energy focused kind of loop. It to some very dangerous thinking. I think we all know that in the 80s and 90s, this idea of the poverty and environment vicious circle was that poverty causes degradation and environmental degradation causes poverty. Been disproved in a number of ways for being overly simplistic and really, you know, in its sort of assumption of poverty as cause and effect of global environmental problems. Instead, on the right, these sort of complex social ecological systems approaches exploring this exact problem. What is the link between poverty and the environment? Some work that was done in Transylvania, which here you see poverty is amount of poverty, and here you see the situation of biodiversity, and they're not directly related to each other. They are linked to each other through multiple very complex feedbacks, and actually poverty largely is influenced by the quality of social capital and the aggregate local economy. And only through that aggregate local economy do we start to see any impacts on biodiversity, usually driven by behaviors and market forces like short-term profiteering, or we see land being sold to foreign landowners, abandoned land, people leaving the coming in and having a flow-through effect on the whole system. So what I think these complex systems approaches isn't sort of more complex answers, right? Making us think that the problems are insoluble. They just are a focused approach to surfacing some of these complex feedback and challenging some of the linear simplistic assumptions of these links between poverty and environmental degradation. And so, for example, this approach recently in looking at a global scale and trying to work with people setting global biodiversity targets. And as we know, the sort of biodiversity community doesn't often say much about poverty or equity or education. And at the same time, the education community or the poverty community doesn't see terribly big links with biodiversity. But by doing a large review of all the literature, we were able to find both positive and negative feedback between biodiversity loss and every single one of the Sustainable Development Goals. And, for example, I think many of you that women and girls a lot worse than it does men. And similarly, more equal societies have better levels of biodiversity protection. We're trying to sort of implement the conceptual framework we proposed in the bottom of your figure, where many are, either study the ecological processes of sustainable development, the social process of sustainable development, but very few people are looking at social ecological interdependencies and feedbacks, link concepts like biodiversity and climate change and energy as we design intervention to address any of them. The second component that we wanted to explore a bit from the social ecological system was this idea of scales work, right? And a lot of policy and development work is very narrow in its thinking scales, that you've got the kind of global policy scale, planning happens at a regional or national scale, and local scale is where the action is. To the sort of closed systems quite in this very hyper-connected context, that things that happen at the global scale can ripple very quickly and can constrain or enable the local scale in. And similarly, things that are done at the scale can ripple quickly through multiple scales to connect in a cross-scale manner to really shape or constrain the global scale. An example of that panning out in front of us right now. This is a slide I used to teach a hypothetical example of zoonotic disease. Now it's no longer hypothetical. We have the COVID example. It tries to break open this idea that disease happens because local populations start to eat bushmeat, right? That's often what we see. Then the disease jumps hosts, gets into humans, and that spreads around the world. But actually, it was in the increased bushmeat hunting. We were seeing rapid rates of deforestation, but also we were seeing collapse of local fish stocks, because at a regional scale, the countries were moving into these waters off the coast of West Africa and depleting their fish stocks. And global climate change driving drought, productivity, and deforestation. And so all of these cross-scale interactions and cascades reduce forest patch size, introduce been interacting before, increase the chances of host transferring this disease ultimately to humans. And then, of course, we have travel and trade allows that we not. So just these ideas of boundaries gives us much greater insight into these pandemics, and they don't just become a global problem that has been shaped by global situations and contexts. And so this has resulted in an area that I'm finding quite interesting, inequity blind spots, right? The fact that something we do here that looks good for sustainability or equity somewhere else. And then these examples of the fact that Europe has done a great job at improving, but it's not because they're eating less fish, because they've displaced the fishing pressure to West African waters, and where many European fish stocks are coming from now. Similarly, Europe and China have met all their targets for improving forest land cover, but it's not because they're using less wood or using less biomass, they just their biomass now in from the tropics. And there we're seeing rampant deforestation. And then there's this example of tourism in Southern Africa. It's supposedly good for sustainability, but at the same time, increased international tourism, greenhouse gas emissions, and climate change. So just a more sort of systems way of thinking through some of the consequences of local national intervention and how they may ripple across sustainability in other parts of the world. So we put the idea that you are dynamically connected and not just a cause or effect of each other. And we came up with a set of case studies where we then identified 10 sort of hypothetical, not hypothetical, but 10 dynamics demonstrate how equity and sustainability kind of context. And some of these have to do with the unequitable distribution of space that already goes around in the world. A lot of them have to do with elite and power dynamic by the market capitalism dynamic and the sort of neoliberal financialized incarnation of that dynamic. Then, of course, there's sort of the environmental dynamics of people becoming increasingly disconnected from local environments through urbanization for equity and sustainability. And then we also have these sort of narrow environmental interventions which lead to exclusion and dispossession and can undermine both. And then we have other ones around collective action and sort of moral and ethical frames on equity and sustainability. And these are just a subset that not just one or the other. And what a lot of this allowed us to do is to iceberg model, which I find very useful, and trends at this kind of surface symptoms. But by digging into these systems, we're starting to see the patterns and processes behind those, the systemic structures and root causes, and of course the worldview, a lot of those. And also, as Abson does in his recent paper on sort of system leverage points, allows us to understand how it's not just about setting new targets for equity or putting up more protected areas. It's really is a fundamental and build institutions to look after sustainability and equity, how we really need to rethink how knowledge is produced and used, and also how we need to human nature or relationships in our food systems, in our urban systems. And so just a last on these kind of more intertwined, beyond their sort of use as an analytic into what's causing equity and sustainability and supposed solutions. I think the one thing that these start to expose us to is the of worldviews, right? The fact that people understand the relationship between nature and humans or between social different ways. And a lot of us who've come to this university model have understood the bull. But in fact, if you look across different knowledge systems or different ways of knowing and worldviews, or the boundary between the social and the ecological in order to do your with. But where you draw that boundary will always be artificial and and in some cases, diversity work doesn't try and draw that. Achieving interesting results when you start to study from a knowledge system and a worldview perspective that doesn't see humans, but rather sees humans as part or in nature. And this, of course, links to value systems. Has done a great job at sort of diversifying and capturing the fact that nature isn't just about livelihood or something you can sell and make money. It has cultural values, sense of place, there's spiritual values, aesthetic values, and also shapes our relationships with nature. And this is mentioning, which starts to look fact that we have this massive knowledge disconnect when you try and pull together global, environmental or social on climate and biodiversity and politics and economics, together with more culturally grounded in situ. And this lovely paper by Sterling, how you might want to actually link and generalized ex situ knowledge production. And I think finally, logical or philosophical component is the basic philosophies that underpin our science. And I mean, Sarah White, who does this amazing work on well-being, isn't basically about a set of resources, but that it's through this interplay of relationships within the personal, social, and environmental spheres. And by Simon West and his colleagues, when we start to bring relational philosophies and understand perhaps different these links between things like equity and nature. And I think this links really on these relationships, cohesion and life support systems as transformative capacities and pathways of the future. And so just in closing, together, this was specifically focused on the dual defining, and hopefully now you have some sense of how they might be interconnected. Sort of fundamentally challenges the way we think about development or economic development or sustainable development as kind of this linear, never-ending with kind of a set of crises, white men in suits propping up through these crises, to understanding development more as sort of an intertwined process, as social and ecological systems shape and are shaped by each other, and the fact that we're trying to nudge these pathways into the future into a space that we call equitable sustainability that thinks about current and future generations and the intertwined links between the two, thresholds and pathways that move an equitable future. I'm going to leave it there. These are the resources where you can find more information, but we can also have a chance now. I'm going to stop sharing.
Great, thank you, Belinda. So, thanks very much for a fantastic talk. I can see lots of comments on the chat in the chat box. Fantastic presentation. So I think we can all agree with that. So now time for the questions. Hand, and then we'll open questions as responses. Make sure I have the right. So, responses, any questions?
Perhaps while people are putting their questions together in the box, but how does to do in linking the sort of climate adaptation, mitigation, and inequality? Are there any thoughts there? Does it resonate, or do you think effective?
No, I think what I'd like to do is give that opportunity to my colleagues from the city, in the audience. Britta, please give some feedback. How does it within TSITICA? Anyone wanting to?
Alia has her hand raised. I don't know if you want to take her question. Alia?
Please.
Thanks
Thanks.
for the presentation. I think it's really nice to see that with the rich resources that you've also shared. I think for me, findings are, let's say, well experienced on the ground. So often work communities, let's say mining affected communities, forest dwellers, experienced as well, to say obviously our with the environment is part of a wider system. Only because our previous region was perhaps a wonderful short film called a community in coast can't fish anymore because of conservation reasons. So I think the grassroots basis more often is intersectional. Experience oppressions through race, through culture, through class, through gender, experiencing environmental injustices as well. The question is about how can we best combine the efforts, with movement capacity with these theoretical and as well as that you can't. How can we bring it together to about more resilience, more adaptation, more fit for purpose intervention?
That's a great sense that convincing that needs to happen is almost at the global scale, right? Where these policies are such separate ways and where science is being funded, where in the climate change space aren't being thought through in a sort of way, because a lot of the work that we're trying to face is the local scale work that you refer to. The boundaries are blurred and the problems are intersectional. So I think it's really been like the work that's been shown on these, both the need to engage with multiple knowledge systems, but also mobilize knowledge systems and policy discourses. And, we've almost seen this disconnect understood at the local scale and the perspectives on these relationships and understood and fostered and funded at the global. And I guess that's one of the key tensions we're trying to address when it comes especially and interventions that aren't being thought through potentially in a holistic way. So I think the project is really key to some of the how we lift that up and how we engage in these spaces where these are. But as I say, I think there's a stronger global South literature that is shaped by these local contexts, but that preconceived notions of separation very powerful in the work that I do.
Thanks, Belinda.
Fiona, there are a few questions in the chat box.
Yes, so I was going to. Awkward would like to ask his. So the question is basically, given the recent global youth legitimacy for youth climate activism that confronts political and business approach to climate action. Does it lie in the futuristic protection of the rights of the youth, or does it from the moral undertone that as custodians of future generations, it's imperative to enhance interdirect?
I mean, I don't necessarily think I have all the answers to that very difficult question. I think by is how we're always focused on equity as an issue for the future and never equity as it's panning out right now. It's not just that climate in the future, it's and so I think that about the intergenerational, and we've put a lot of response for that, for both making change now and the impacts that will be felt in the future. But I'm wondering that look at the context we live in, useful in showing that, you know, people are worse off now because of climate change and because of these political and economic approaches to I'd say a lack of climate action. But I'm not sure I necessarily understand of that question. So if someone else is working on youth and climate, thoughts?
To anyone else here in the audience working on youth and climate change that would like to add? I see back here from Camp, and she's been research coordinator of our TSITICA program. And she said, noisy space, trying to understand the relationship of the many justices or injustices that you framed in your presentation. Getting a number of questions looking at the relationship of within country inequalities and climate policy and other project and mitigation. And just to add to that, what I found very useful was that diagram that the procedural, the distributional, and I think was,
yeah.
I think that's really useful and is critical to our project, and in, you know, poverty and inequality outcomes. So we're still working around, and that I think will be very useful, particularly for my work package, which will be doing the on-the-ground work, looking specifically at how projects on the ground, climate change or adaptation or mitigation projects or energy projects on the ground have actually been able to address not just the climate risk, but also poverty and inequality.
Yeah, I think those are the kind of studies and approaches we really need, and you know, and also understanding that even those different dimensions of inequality can interact with each other, right? So we often always focused on economic measures of equality, and missing the sort of cultural or social or even environmental dimensions of equality, and how those may be intersecting, and how what's good for one may not be good for others. So I think, you know, setting these kinds of interventions to really be clear about some of the we
a really great presentation. You really brought it together. It's just fantastic, especially when, sometimes you focus much on the climate change lens and so much on the development lens. So that's fun. But based right now, I mean, one thing, you know, the dimensions we are actually looking at to poverty and inequality, and how it is from a quantitative perspective. Just mentioned the side, and where we are also wondering, do we need to include other than what type of indicator, you know, how do we go about capture more the intangible factors that are critical but overlooked, you know? Yeah,
I mean, that is I find sometimes it's down to the indicators that this complexity and richness it's lost because we're stuck with we can measure like income or pollution. And I think that is going to be one of the challenges to come up with these more intertwined approaches, and working a bit with Red Cross on sort of security. And they've been having interesting success in combining indicators, more the classic climate indicators that they've been using for their work. You know, I think that probably from 2016, when this World Social Science report was released with these dimensions, we've seen a lot more activity in the indicator and measures of people trying to, you know, I think we want to away from this idea that you need one measure that is the equity index, right, that brings together all these dimensions, lose their interactions, and also lose the fact that indicator is a good thing in one, but maybe a bad thing in another context. And so rather coming up some measures or a measuring system that holds those multiple dimensions. I think there's a group called the ARUA Resilience Building Fund that I've been working with based on ARUA, and they've been doing interesting work on sort of these more multidimensional tricks and thinking about links to equity and concepts of resilience. So I think there is stuff there, but I agree with you, it is a huge challenge to hold this richness as we move into the sort of modern reporting and accountability systems. See, Kaya was saying that.
I think Mark New had a question.
Okay.
Mark, do you want to ask your question or type it?
Yeah, hi. It's fine. Question's pretty much been answered.
There's a Karina in chat has asked a question.
Hi, thank you for a great presentation and a wonderful way of looking at the interlinkage flows. I think it's absolutely critical to the whole sustainability debate, and I'm so happy to see it happening. I just have one question, and that's whether in all of this you're doing, whether you are looking at the relationships, you were about the changeable trends, and you were talking about the rapid change that are happening. The driver of that is the development and settlements, towns or cities, these huge mega agglomerations that are happening over the world, and they are putting a huge strain impact on the resources, different resources, and also contribute greatly, often in a negative climate change. So yeah, I'm wondering if you are considering the role of human science as part of your project, and if so not, we'd be very interested to speak to you. I'm from the School of Environment. I work very closely with Krishna Duplessis, and I'm looking at resilient and regenerative cities. I think, you know, this is so great, the kind of work that you do, and I think there's a lot of alignment. Yeah, that's the question. Thank you.
Great, Karina. I mean, I think key issues, we do actually in 2018 paper, we look at the potential for sort of these urban solidarity economy type of transitions. We don't go into detail of that, but it certainly is the key drivers of those dynamics I listed. And the environmental disconnection dynamic behind the sort of market capitalism, the status consumption dynamic, and I think increasingly that collective action dynamic. There aren't many examples of collective action in large settlements. You know, collective action seems to have a maximum threshold. I think that it's a key challenge is system space. Two of the domains that we really need to do some more thinking in. So I look forward to following up with you next time in Pretoria.
Thanks, and thanks for the great discussion.
Great. And Shion and Claire, perhaps I can just offer that my email address is there. We'll send a presentation, and if anyone wants to touch them as.
Thank you very much, Belinda. I also had people ask if there's a recording. I think you have been recording this.
Yes, we have. So keep an eye out on social media. Well, I'll also send the link to everyone who registered.
Great, thanks. Are there any more questions? See, it's now just after 1 o'clock.
Awesome.
Okay.
Hi, Prof. I hope you're well. So I'm currently doing masters at UP. Our program has given us a task of coming away and we contribute towards social and environmental, and I had chosen literary legal dumping in townships. And throughout the course of my, I've just been wondering how and this is within South African context, how we pique the interest of young people in social and environmental matters, particularly environmental matters, because they affect the social aspect as well, because we are people. Is of this country and the world as well. And for example, if young people are critic towards politics, then what ultimately happens is that you probably have leaders who in policy neglect the well-being of the earth, affect people as well. So just always just wondered how we can maybe pick young people in these issues. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I have a lot of expertise in this stuff. I think, you know, there's some thoughts around education and sustainability, challenging our preconceived notion of how we're educated, which knowledge systems, the difference between education and schooling. Some colleagues in Uganda have been working on that in terms of kind of naming knowledge and education in the African context. So I think that that's also to think about. And I think the problems you mentioned, the groups you work with, it's also interesting to think about that from a sort of wider perspective in terms of provision, education structure, and all of those things that contribute to problems such as and not just a behavior change necessarily, but also, you know, a lot deeper and a lot more nuanced. But again, you know, if you want to get in touch, share some of those resources, or get in touch with some people who are looking at, you know, we also found these interesting connections between sustainability and education and how both can enhance each other and improve equity. But that's not necessarily thinking in the kind of classic environment. Thanks for that question.
I think we're going to take the last question from Richard Makuya. Richard, do you want to ask your question? I'm not sure if he's there. Shame. Shiona had to leave, so I think we're gonna wrap up unless there are any other questions. Belinda, could you type your email address in the chat box just so that everyone has it if they would like to email you. Otherwise, I have posted the TSITICA contact details, so you can go via me if you would like to. Oh, there it is. Thank you so much.
On my as well as the website with more resources.
Great. Thank you so much for your very insightful, and everyone seemed to have enjoyed it today. It was really fascinating. Thank you, Belinda. And we're looking forward to having you with the ACDI for another webinar early next year. So everybody, I know we haven't organized that yet, but yeah, the ACDI will get on that soon. So thank you so much for joining the TSITICA team today, and we'll see everyone soon. Have a great day further. Bye.
Thank you so much, Claire. Thanks for setting this up. And hi, Mom. Thanks for listening. And to everyone else.
Thank you. Bye.